Hello, friends of .NET. We are live with another version of the .NET Community Stand-Up, focusing on language and runtime. And today we have a few interesting topics. We will talk about ARM. We will talk about update on .NET Standard, and then whatever Kathleen and Philip will interject at any given point in time, we'll also talk about. So how about you introduce yourself? Rich, start.
Stop typing. Pay attention. Yeah, I'm Rich. Work on the runtime and other parts of the platform, and I'm excited to be here. It's been a while.
Kathleen, you're next.
Yeah, and hello, how are you doing today? And we definitely would like to get some questions from you about what you care about. So if you're listening in today, I'm Kathleen Dollard. I'm a PM on the working with .NET SDK, CLI, languages, templates, kind of all over the map. So like all of us here, we can answer questions about a number of things. So see if we can get some conversations going today.
And then we have two Philips. One of them needs to introduce himself.
Well, yes. Hi, my name's Philip, and I work on languages, compilers, and tooling for said languages in Visual Studio.
And only the little Philip can talk, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's how it works.
All right.
You know, it's pretty easy to change, thanks to Microsoft, corporation, Teams, trademark. There we go. I have a nice collage of ammo.
And then Kathleen is now back again. So like last time, my name is Will Lenworth. I'm a PM on the .NET platform team, so I focus on class libraries, .NET Standard that we briefly talk about, and whatever else comes up usually. So Rich, do you want to start talking about ARM?
Yes. I was just preparing. Let's see if we can actually do this in a sensible way. I was preparing some links to share with you. So so this is about ARM64. We have kind of two projects in the hopper right now related to that, and one that we've done. So we added support for Linux ARM64 with 3.0, I think. I should know these things because I worked on them. But and then with 5.0, we've been adding support for Windows ARM64. So that's for the Surface Pro X and other similar sorts of devices. Like I have an Asus device that's like 50 centimeters away from me right now that I use for my testing here at home. Let's talk about Windows ARM64 first. So basically our plan for ARM64 was kind of twofold for Windows, which was let's make sure we can offer all the functionality that is available on x64 Windows, and so that's what we've been doing. WPF isn't there yet. Windows Forms is, and I've been using it on my Windows ARM64 box, and pretty good. Like I don't really actually notice much of a difference compared to my x64 or laptop class machines. Separately, we've been doing another project, which is make ARM64 much closer to parity with x64 from a pure chip standpoint, and I'll find the link for that in just a sec. And that's one of those asymptotically approaching parity types of topics. But we've actually made some major gains in 5.0. So for people that are actually running on ARM64, they should see some big wins. Separately, Apple actually announced that they're moving to their own ARM-based chip for their new laptops, which they're going to first start shipping later this year. Which is, that had kind of been predicted for a long time. Apple's been investing a ton in their A-style chips in the iPhone and the iPad. I think they're up to A12 now. So this is the 12th generation of that chip. They bought a company 10 years ago or something like that, and they've clearly made that a real thing. So we, various teams at Microsoft, like Office, presumably teams like VS Code, and the .NET Core team and Xamarin. We all have to like figure out what we're going to do, and obviously we're going to support the new Macs. And yeah, so we're starting a project. We have dev kits coming to Microsoft. They've actually mostly arrived already, and there's two kind of ways you can run code on these laptops. One is, well, actually, one thing I should clarify, we actually don't know their laptops. Apple hasn't specified what the form factor of the first set of new Macs is going to be. We talked to them. They were actually quite clear on that to us. I'm just saying I think they're laptops, but I don't actually have that information. They could be anything. And so anyway, you can run emulated in this thing called Rosetta 2, which will run x64 Intel code, or you can run natively with ARM64. So anyway, that's what we're working on. Our goal, as always, is to make it so that you can run .NET code in the places you want, and this falls into that. So I'll share some links with Emo, who will then share them with actually maybe I'll start passing them to him. Let's see, what would be the most.
So when you say like support the new chip, like what can you outline what kind of work you would have to do? Because I think it's abstract for most people, like what that actually means.
Yes. Okay. Let me bring up my other Teams window, and we'll do this in. Okay, this is the right one, I think. So here's a tweet. Now I'll try and get ahead of you. Here's it. Did you get that?
Yeah. So do you want to present them, or how should I do this?
No, you can do it. You can do it.
Okay, then
you're my butler.
I'm right.
Yeah. So I try and be as public and transparent as possible about the work that we're doing. So I did a tweet that kind of showed the work we had to do. A bunch of it is with these. There's like kind of two major aspects. One is, or there's a few aspects. One is, as you'll see in the tweet, there's this concept of hardened runtimes, which already exists in Mac OS, like x64. And now they're going to apply that to ARM64 all the time. So we already had support for hardened runtimes, but now we have to make sure that support is kind of polished. That's presumably okay. Yeah, we have to make sure that work is polished. The next thing is there's like this page model, and here I'm talking about like memory pages and how they're marked. So in some cases, the .NET Runtime relies on read, write, execute pages, and those are not acceptable in this new environment. So we have to either have read, execute, or read write. So this is called write exclusive execute pages. So we have to do work for that. In this blog that I think Emo is bringing up now it's actually from 5 years ago of this same work going on in Firefox. That was just a good blog post that we found out about. So it's largely a security feature. And then the last thing is, for some scenarios, Apple requires universal binaries, which have both x64 and ARM64 code in them, and we don't support that today. So we're looking into that. So that's kind of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I think I'm done.
I'm having trouble getting the thing up, but it will eventually come up. There we go.
Yeah, well, I see that. So hopefully other people do. Yeah, on this particular thing, write exclusive execute, the Windows team has actually asked us to do this in the past, and we hadn't previously funded it, so we'll be funding it now, and presumably bringing it to all platforms. We haven't quite made all the decisions yet, but that's my expectation.
Right.
Okay.
So I just learned another thing. Apparently, when I share myself with Teams, then I can't just share the Teams window of OBS. That doesn't work. So I guess next time somebody else should share it, because that's the same problem with the camera, right? OBS or Teams doesn't show your own camera. So anyway, so we now have the blog post up.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's Firefox in their JIT. It's not just a JIT problem. It's actually from us more of a runtime problem than a JIT problem, but same difference.
Right.
So I don't have anything more to say about this particular blog post. It's just a good piece of context if people want to read more about the general problem space. And I'll just share this with you too. I don't know if you're going to be able to show that, but Apple has a document that we're using that has much of the information about their guidance, and we talked to them specifically about this document.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I think Apple wants the phrase Apple Silicon to be used more than ARM64. So that's when you see us blogging about it, we'll be using that term primarily.
So is that the same as ARM64 then? Like, does it mean that our work actually works only for Apple, or does it work for anything that is ARM64?
Yes and no. The short version is pretty much everything is ARM64 standard, like standard ARM64 stuff. They have an API that other operating systems do not have, which is documented in this page. That is an OS level concept that we actually think is good, that we will be using, that is Apple specific, and we will not be able to use on other operating systems for our implementation of write exclusive execute. But other than that, like the other thing is, these are actually ARM64E chips, which I'm not too sure if those are used elsewhere, but we'll eventually be implementing some additional ARM64 instructions as well, but not in V1. Anyway, I think we've kind of spent enough time on this.
Makes sense. All right, so yeah, I want to quickly talk about where we are with .NET Standard. Like a while ago, I published a blog post, I think it was August last year, where I dragged some of the numbers from NuGet.org to see how far we are with adoption. And since I'm now in the midst of writing a blog post for what happens in .NET 5, I was also basically pulling the latest numbers. And so I thought I'd share the numbers with you and also talk a little bit about how we collect these numbers. Because I think the blog post will probably not go into too much detail on this one, but it might be interesting to people. So let me just share the screen really quick. So basically where we are right now is we have, when we look at NuGet.org, we basically look at packages that are not owned by Microsoft, and we also exclude packages that are not library packages. Like, they're still, JavaScript-based NuGet packages that you would install into ASP.NET apps, for example. And so if we only look at those, then in the top 1,000, 77% of them support .NET Standard, which is much higher than what we had in August. I think August was, I want to say 60%. And then if you look at all packages that are active, meaning they were updated within the last 6 months, about 60% of them support .NET Standard, which is quite a bit. When we look at all packages on NuGet.org, then it's only 40%, but that's also kind of expected because, there's a long tail, right? Not all packages are actively maintained, and not all packages would benefit from this. The numbers by themselves are not always the most interesting ones. Sometimes you need to look at an actual graph. So we also have that. We have a plotting over time. So for example, if you look at top 1,000, you can kind of see that we have this, asymptotic curve now, where basically what it tells us is that we cannot really expect growth anymore in the top 1,000. So we are about 800 packages in, which kind of makes sense, right? Because not all packages, and even in the top 1,000, are actively maintained. So that's kind of what you would expect, I guess. So I think as far as top 1,000 goes, close to 80%, I think is fine. And then when we look at the long tail, this is basically all packages, right? You see more of a power curve kind of thing, or exponential curve. There's this little blip here where it's plateaued. And my first inclination was to say, like, okay, we messed up our data collection. But talking to our data guys, it's actually not the case, because what we do is we ingest NuGet.org data. At the time it was published to NuGet.org, so even if we mess up our collection, that should not impact this. And so the running hypothesis is, if you look at the dates, that's kind of like the beginning of 2020. And so some people say maybe that has to do with COVID, that people had other issues or vacation or some other stuff that that was out of the ordinary. But it's an interesting blip that we don't really have a good explanation for right now. Yeah, basically the idea here is, if you look at the curve here, you can expect more growth, right? So like I think NuGet.org has total 250,000 unique packages. So we are about, what is it, 90,000 packages in with .NET Standard support. So that looks like there's more growth still to be expected, which again also makes sense, right? Because even if you look at the last 6 months, there's plenty of packages that are only updated when somebody really twists the package maintainer's arm, and that might only happen like once every year, right? I have certainly NuGet packages that I published 10 years ago almost, and I only update them when I have to, right? So that's kind of where we are with numbers. So I think, all in all, I think it looks pretty healthy. Massive adoption, which basically means almost everything that is on NuGet.org can be referenced via .NET Standard. And as you probably know, we have this compat mode anyway. So if we don't find the .NET Standard binary, we will fall back to the .NET Framework binary. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the binary will work, right? So it's still very important for us to see that package maintainers are actually actively targeting .NET Standard and do, the tests and all the other things that come with it to make sure that their stuff actually works across all .NET versions. Any questions about that? Maybe even from the people on the call. No questions? Everybody's happy? That's hard to believe.
Well, that's pretty good numbers. It's hard to say bad things about these numbers, isn't it?
That's true. I guess that is a fair point.
Actually, I have a question, which is, and I wasn't paying complete attention because I was actually responding to questions in the chat. So I saw on the slide it said, top 100 or 1,000 excludes Microsoft packages, which makes sense. But what is the process looking like for Microsoft packages? Because clearly people care about those.
Right. Yeah. So the way our data collection works is we use this thing Custo in Azure, which is I think it's called Data Lake. I think publicly. I forgot. But basically,
I think it's called Custo as well.
Okay.
Publicly.
And basically, we ingest effectively the data from NuGet.org when people publish, and then we can run queries over that. And so what this tells us is effectively every single time somebody updates a package, we basically know what contents are in the package, and we have all the metadata, right? And so what this number means is basically for this query we just excluded where the author is set to Microsoft, right? And so we're also looking at the Microsoft one. The problem that we have is in the top 1,000, I guess, is that we ship a bunch of NuGet packages that are effectively part of the .NET platform, right? So they are very popular by the sheer fact that they're referenced by everybody. And given that they're part of the platform, they're always maintained, right? And so that's why it's kind of weird to look at those, because they would completely bias the picture towards, everything is super well maintained and supports .NET Standard, right? And so that's why we exclude Microsoft from those queries to focus on the third-party library ecosystem, which is a little bit more interesting. But at the same time, internally, we do have a first-party engagement where we basically work with people inside of Microsoft that are not part of the .NET platform, right? So for example, the Azure SDK is, you can think of it maybe as part of the .NET platform, but it's not, right? It's another team that basically builds an SDK for various languages, including .NET. And so we, of course, want to work with them to make sure that their stuff is available for .NET Standard, and that is going as well. I don't have the numbers on those today, but that would be an interesting number to look at as well. And we do track that internally. There's a chart somewhere that we maintain.
So there's an interesting question in the chat that I think is worth a little bit of conversation, which is when's VS going to make the jump? When's Visual Studio going to make the jump to .NET Core? And I think it's an interesting question right now, particularly since we've got code spaces out there, and we are looking at major evolutions in Visual Studio. we're the .NET Core people who look at what Visual Studio is doing, not the Visual Studio people who actually know what's going on. So I have to caveat with that as a start, but I think we probably still have a perspective on that. So go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, I would say that there are things in Visual Studio today that 100% cannot work and will not ever work on .NET Core, and so those would necessarily have to change to be able to make Visual Studio work on .NET Core. What's interesting, it's not like a question of could that work be done, because given enough time, we have plenty of talented engineers who could certainly make some definition of Visual Studio run on .NET Core. What's more challenging is okay, well, if you chop off this piece and then this piece and then this piece to make it work, how many customers are you losing because of that? Because those people depend on some things working as they do today, and they don't want to wake up to find that, oh, there's a new version of Visual Studio and the thing that I use every day is now gone. Oops.
And that's not just Microsoft Creative Visual Studio pieces. There's a lot of Visix support that's out there. We have an ecosystem, and not everyone is using pieces of that ecosystem, but the people that are, it's pretty critical to them getting their job done. So we also have this ecosystem, which is also invested in the current old way of doing things. I think we're making steps. So, for example, there's going to be changes coming up to the template engine to make the new project dialog work better behind the scenes, and that's going to wind up affecting some templates. They'll be backwards compat. Excuse me, but there are changes that are going on. But at the moment, they're finding the soft spots that we can get the most value for changes that you will either not see or see only as improvements, and that's kind of the first place to work that from. Visual Studio as a whole is just it's an enormous beast, and so it is going to be hard to get it all onto a .NET Core platform. And as Philip said, it's going to be especially hard if we have to look at things that we're doing today that we're hacking through Chrome things that we would have to do a completely different way.
So just on that note, we also work with plenty of other first parties, but VS is just a very obvious one because it's a big one that we all use. But the reality is that almost everybody who has a big application, whether it's Exchange or SharePoint or VS itself, given that they're all fairly old, right? They're all 10, 15, 20 years old. They pretty much use every technology we have in .NET Framework, right? So if you port the whole thing wholesale, or if that's your approach, then almost that requires a rewrite of large chunks of it, right? So almost all teams, including VS, they try this the other way around. They say, okay, what is the net new things we're building, and how can we make sure that those investments carry forward to core, right? So somebody in chat already mentioned that in VS, for example, we already have things out of proc, and so some parts that run out of proc are actually running in .NET Core out of proc already today. So that means, there's some IPC going on, right? We exchange messages with these processes, and these processes can run on core. They don't have to run on full framework, right? But if you look at, Visual Studio itself, they use app domains, they use remoting, right? They have in-proc designer stuff running still in some cases. And so
WCF is in there.
WCF is in there, right? And moving all of this stuff is hard. And so one major investment we have done with .NET Core recently was moving the Winforms Designer from in-proc in Visual Studio to out of proc so that we can actually run the design on .NET Core, even though Visual Studio is rendering the control, right? And those are the kind of work that needs to happen to make more and more parts of VS run on core, because we can't do it all. So we have to do it piecemeal somehow.
I'll just add a couple thoughts on that, which is you folks have kind of said this, but I just want to make it super explicit, which is so we basically have a policy that we're only going to have one runtime in the VS process, and right now here we're talking about devm.exe. So right now that's .NET Framework, and so any .NET Core uses, for example, the Windows Forms Designer, it then necessarily needs to be out of proc. So this is kind of what Emo was getting at. And so if VS ever does go on top of .NET Core, then that whole thing would switch, which is .NET Core would be in proc. It would be the only in proc runtime in devm, and all the .NET Framework scenarios would then become out of proc. And then this kind of ties in with what Kathleen was saying. So done it. So VS does use a lot of COM as its traditional model for componentry, and done it core actually has fine support for COM, so it can totally do that. What the challenge is that COM API assumes in-process calls. And so if some of those things that today either call or are called as COM APIs move out of process, then that's the fundamental issue at play, is that unless you build some kind of transparent transport, which is probably impossible, then it's not really the fact that they're COM that is the problem. It's that they moved outside the process. So
yeah, I mean, that's usually the problem, is that, like, COM had this idea of transparent, like, boundaries, right? And then very often doesn't necessarily work when you make assumptions on the receiving end that you're in the same process as the UI control. And so, yeah, that's kind of the work. But Rich, you said something that is interesting. You said we made the decision that in VS we will only have one runtime. We generally don't support dual runtime activation anyway, right? We don't allow .NET Core and .NET Framework in the same process.
Special.
It's not VS specific.
Yeah.
It's not special, yeah.
Good point.
And you can run into these boundary crossings, which are a little painful right now in odd places. So actually right now we have a Visual Basic issue still open on the Winforms Designer, because the way that you have to, when you double click on a control, you expect to go to the existing code for that control. Well, that involves several calls back and forth to find it in Visual Basic, because it can be in more places than it can be in C#. So it's a somewhat more complicated solution there. And it requires some hops across that boundary, and obviously that's not desirable to put a lot of those in. So we're still looking for a better answer for that solution, because sometimes this can be a challenging problem when you have an out of proc piece, and where you're jumping back and forth across these boundaries into things that are like, really, Visual Studio is so welded to your source code, more so than I think probably anything else that's out there. It is your source code, and that's in proc. Your source code is in proc in the Win32 framework part of Visual Studio. And everything else has to talk through that, and that can be challenging.
So one question in chat is kind of like, how does .NET Core support COM? Rich, do you want to talk a little bit more about what that means and how it works, or what is supported and what isn't?
Okay. now you're putting me on the spot.
You're welcome.
I think, from what I understand, I've been working with folks like Aaron Robinson and Jeremy K. I can't remember actually how to pronounce his last name. And from what they've led me to believe, .NET Core supports most of the things the .NET Framework does. So, for example, it supports in-proc and out-of-proc managed COM servers. It actually has some features I think that .NET Framework doesn't even have. In terms of like the COM interfaces that it supports most of the same ones. My understanding is that .NET Core's iDispatch, there's something around this vicinity of iDispatch. It doesn't do the same thing as .NET Framework, so I think that is a feature gap. But for the most part, it can do the same thing. So, for example, like, I don't know, 2 years ago now, there was a demo created of like a .NET Core console application automating Office. Excel is what I meant to say. So most COM scenarios work. The iDispatch one, and I could be slightly using the wrong term. I think the only one I'm aware of.
The only thing that I'm running into is because I have a console app that automates Excel, and apparently the APIs I call require parts of the dynamic language runtime, the DLR part, for dynamic support, and apparently that doesn't work on Core yet.
I think I remember also seeing a conversation on that. Not so much Excel in particular, but the dynamic thing. I used to remember that being added in 5.0.
You haven't tried
Have
on
you
5.
tried that on 5.0?
No, I think the last I tried was 3.1, I believe. So
Okay,
it's possible
I
that we already have
seem
it.
to think that was added in 5.0.
That would be cool, so
But
I could port
don't
my
hold
stuff
me
to
to
core. Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I mean, some people seem to be confused that it works in principle, but that shouldn't be super confusing because .NET Core has Windows-only features, right, by heritage. And yeah, if you try to activate a COM control on Linux, that won't work, right? But that's the same way as passing a Windows-style path to the path APIs when you're running on Linux, right? If you say c:\blah, that also won't work on Linux, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't have COM support on Windows. The other question I had was, so what happens with COM activation when Office loads an add-in, right? Because when we're running on .NET Framework, they can activate the .NET Framework runtime because it's centrally installed in the box. How does that work with .NET Core-based sim things?
Oh, sorry, I was only half listening, but I think I understand what you're asking. You're saying if you expose a managed COM component and it needs the runtime to load, what are the rules around that?
Well, how does it work?
Question?
Yeah, basically, does it work at all? And if so, like, how does it work? Yeah.
Yeah, it does work. We worked on this, and it has a slightly different policy than loading applications. So with applications, the rule is that we roll forward on servicing versions. So actually backing up, the major problem at play here that we're trying to address, again, is one runtime in the process, which we just discussed with VS. And so, so for applications, we roll forward on servicing version. That doesn't make sense in this case because you could have multiple runtimes that were made for one for 3.0, one for 3.1, one for 5.0. And I think we either made the choice that by default it's the latest major, much like .NET Framework traditionally was, or it was latest minor version for the major version you used or something. I can't remember the exact rule, but it basically rolled forward farther than applications do.
Makes sense.
So that's one aspect. The other aspect is we only support shared framework managed COM components, and this is for a very similar reason because, some people would like self-contained ones, but then by definition, it's going to be the self-contained runtime of one of the COM components that you loaded into the process, and we actually had a fair bit of trouble reasoning about that. So we decided not to support that scenario at all. So, and not everyone likes this, but it assumes it will only load the runtime from the global location.
I mean, it kind of makes sense because, once you do self-contained, you may do trimming or other things, and then it's like, well, we get half a runtime or something, right? That's
another good. I actually don't even think we got as far as discussing that point, but that's an excellent point.
That kind of is, it's the same problem that you had on .NET Framework, right? Once you had multiple runtimes, the first COM component that gets activated basically gets to choose, and everybody else just gets whatever that person decided, right? I think I remember, back in the day, we wrote our own native shim that basically, so we had a policy that basically says use the latest framework that's on the box, so that if we get loaded earlier, that we don't regress somebody else's COM component that targeted a later version. But that only helped us when we were the ones loaded first. If somebody else got loaded first, they didn't have the custom shim, and so they were running on some other version, and then our stuff would still break.
Well, Office actually had custom code in MSO.dll to help the quote unquote kind of middle actor.
It has been a long time. I also don't. I think that might have been would-be time frame when we did that. So God knows. So that's nice. So any other question in chat regarding COM? I'm just looking over that. Some people said some of the stuff in VS language service compiler MSBuild are running out of proc already. Moving that to core would be improving perf, and that's what I mentioned earlier. Like some of the stuff already runs on core, right? If you
not necessarily. There's, I mean, yeah, .NET Core has perf compared to .NET Framework, but something as massive as a language service, there's kind of no guarantee that something is going to be measurably better.
you're responding to the perf claim, not the claim that some of the stuff runs on core.
That's just on a case-by-case basis. Like,
right.
You can only really know when you're measuring things, because like these language services are extremely complicated, doing a lot of work, and it may turn out that the kinds of performance benefits that exist in core CLR are just kind of like in the margin compared to other things that you could do.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Like I mean, that's the general problem with like people comparing perf, right? So we talk a lot about the perf improvements on .NET Core, and I think Steven is writing another blog post on that. But like a good chunk of it has to do with server, right? So meaning it doesn't really apply if you let's say port your WPF app to core. That in and of itself may not result in a perf improvement because it depends on where you're spending your perf, right? If you have not made WPF significantly faster on core, nor have you made Winforms significantly faster on core, right? But if you do a lot of file I/O, maybe that's faster because we improved file I/O. But like that's the same thing with language services, right? Depending on what you do, and a good chunk of it is just compute that the compiler has to do with resolving symbols, and that doesn't necessarily benefit from us improving file I/O, right? And so that's it always depends on the scenario.
Yeah, and I mean, there's other good reasons to move language services to core. Like, I mean, I think that is sort of like, I think most of us who work on this stuff do want to ultimately move to core. But like, yeah, I mean, typically the perf problems that we have are not really compute. It's really two things. The first is just allocating more than we need to. That's usually the biggest thing in causing the GC to do a whole bunch of work that it shouldn't need to do. And then the second is just doing more compute than necessary for certain things. Like, there was this kind of long-standing thing that has been recently resolved, I believe in 16.7 and Roslyn, where we were keeping a lot of old syntax trees sort of resident in memory for some kind of niche scenarios that just so that we wouldn't have to recompute them. But it turned out that being stuck in memory was, causing the GC to go wild for very, very large solutions, and in some cases it would cause Visual Studio to go for little benefit to most users. And so it was one of those things where, like, like switching the runtime in that sort of scenario wouldn't actually help the problem at all. The problem was really just sort of a design decision that was like useful for some less common cases, but not as useful for much more common cases where you have larger solutions. And like working out those sorts of problems, that's usually where language service performance comes into play.
Big thing is also that because we have separate processes now, we have effectively independent GCs, and we also effectively have, for some of the out-of-proc stuff, this 32-bit memory limit doesn't apply because the out-of-proc things can run in 64-bit and can use more memory, which also means you can burn more data with caches, right?
Right. Well, you can also run into just a separate problem altogether. So, like, there was this Teams thread from Kevin Pilch, who's the lead for like all things ASP.NET right now. And I remember he said that he had the entire ASP.NET code base open in Visual Studio Code on his laptop. And he like left it on overnight or something like that. And so what's important there is the VS Code model is, the language service runs as a separate process, in this case a 64-bit process. And when he opened up his laptop, it was using 17 gigabytes of RAM, and the machine was just paging memory the entire time nonstop. And it was basically like his laptop was useless. And so he was like, oh, well, turns out, 64-bit doesn't magically solve a problem. It can, depending on the problem, it can just shove it under the rug and, move it somewhere else. And so, it's one of those things where, like, if your code base needed like 3 gigabytes or something, or 4 gigabytes, or like just an extra couple of gigabytes, then, being 64-bit would probably be okay. But like, it's not one of those sort of like blanket solutions that we have. And it's Yeah, and I actually view that very similarly to the move it to .NET Core thing. Like, in some cases, moving something to .NET Core will just result in a lot of things working better, but in other cases, it won't really have any measurable impact. And so, or it'll just like, you maybe had this other problem and it just kind of shifted it somewhere else.
And you might also make things worse, right? Because the thing is, like, moving to core holistically, very unlikely making things worse. But if part of your stuff has to remain on full framework, then you would have to coordinate effectively now between the .NET Framework process and the .NET Core process. And a good example is the Winforms Designer, where every time you drag a control now or you interact with the control, you basically have to call across the process boundaries, right? And getting this thing performant is not impossible, but it's of course work that we have to do to make the designer feel snappy, right? And so that's also why when people say perf, it highly depends. And somebody in chat rightfully pointed out we compare perf all the time, right? And there's some truth to that, right? Like marketing has to happen and we need to have some bullet points on that list. But I mean, we pretty much always say that, perf is in the eye of the beholder. Measure the things you care about and then compare the numbers for yourself, because it's really hard to say, things like core is 3 times faster than full framework, right? That's like almost all these claims are wrong depending on what the benchmark is you're looking at.
Yeah, and there's also on the language service front specifically an interesting thing about moving out of proc. Like the more things you move out of proc, it's sort of this point that you made about having to coordinate data back and forth between different processes. That can have an impact on someone. Like there actually is a benefit to being in process for things like diagnostics or just getting very, very quick feedback on a change that you made in an editor, because the engine that sort of has to compute whatever that change meant and then report stuff back to the user doesn't have to cross a process boundary, right? It's already there. It's just ready to go. And so if you're now hopping between processes, say maybe you have LSP and you're having that data being serialized into JSON and then deserialized back into some objects and doing stuff like that, that is a cost. And it's not necessarily, I would say on the whole, that cost is worth it. Like I'm personally of the belief that all language services should be out of process, but it's also it's non-zero. Like moving out of proc will also have those sort of like little usability things that you may take for granted today, where there's kind of like some subtle behavior change that you're like, oh, it kind of looks and feels a little different to me, and that. It's unclear if that's like positive or negative, because I think it just depends on the person and what they expect out of their tooling. But yeah, those things have to be considered.
Speaking of consideration and complicated choices, Rich wanted to talk about Ubuntu 19.10 reaches end of life in July 2020. Rich, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the thing I wanted to talk about, and actually now that you have it up, I realize there's even another issue to share. So we've been doing what I call distro management for quite some time, and what that means is like we support like half a dozen or some number of Linux distros, and yeah, I just found the other one, and we haven't actually been like super transparent about exactly what that process looks like, and it's not like not transparent in really a bad sense. I guess it's like that thing is like, don't think what is malicious for something that's incompetence. So this is definitely in the incompetence arena, and so we just haven't been telling people like this is what we're doing. So Ubuntu 19.10 is a version of Ubuntu that we support. And we're being like super public saying it's going end of life on the 17th of July. And then we have like all this like tear down of support for our kind of like, machinery. And so starting 17th of July, that's when we're going to start tearing it down. Until 17th of July, we will support it. And 17th of July is their date. Actually, I asked the team to start doing this kind of thing. The first one we did it with was Alpine 312. I shared that link with you, Emo, if you want to show it. And so we're planning on posting these types of issues for both new distro versions that we support and EOLs, like end of life ones as well. And our goal with the new versions is like we don't have a promise of same day support, but we're gonna try and aim for that. So we will like start. So like Ubuntu 2010 is probably the next release that we will add support for. And so I'm hoping like, maybe a month and a half or 2 months ahead of time that there's an issue that gets posted for Ubuntu 2010 to say this is what our process looks like. And once all the checkboxes are checked, then that basically means it's supported. So I see that as a move forward in kind of sophistication for the .NET project.
So when you say issues, like usually we post this in announcements, right? No, because they're all in the core repo.
So I think what we should do is there's actually a digest for product changes that is in the core repo. I'll ask the team to link to those. Yeah, I think these are a little too much noise for the announcements, although repo, but I'd look for feedback on that. Certainly from a checkbox checking perspective, I think it's overkill to have these in the announcements repo.
Sure.
And like, we want yeah. So I'd look for feedback on where people want these to be posted.
Yeah, this seems more like a work item tracking thing, right? Versus announcements would be just, okay, we just moved it out or we just edited it or whatever, right?
Yeah.
All right, so that makes sense. So one question came up in chat is .NET 5, so .NET 5 is only a few months away. Is the feature set pretty much locked down at this point, or you're still looking for stuff to add? I think it's pretty much locked down at this point. Like we, of course, still have some issues on the list that we want to finish. There's some work we haven't started yet, but we are not actively looking for net new features at this point. I mean, of course, exceptions exist everywhere, right? But that's we want to ship at some point.
Well, like the only sort of exception to the rule would be something like Apple Silicon.
Right, like something that is, unexpected or whatever. But yeah, I mean, like we're still adding APIs, right? Like we're still reviewing community PRs and other stuff, but like we're not like hunting for new things to add to the backlog. What about macOS on ARM?
I wanted to briefly, at least on the language side, certainly I think for C# we're pretty much, C# 9 we're pretty much locking down now. I mean, there's like little design quirks here and there for the existing features that have shipped in preview that are certainly subject to addition or change or whatever, but no big new C# features. And then on F# we are looking to there's 2 more features we're looking to finish, and then I think there's another that we may add, string interpolation, but that's going to be like a quality call. Like if we have confidence that we could merge the feature and it would work for most people, but there's a question of if it's going to be, enough or like good enough, I should say, or such that we put it in preview, or we just sort of like hold off and don't even merge it in behind a preview flag. We're kind of gonna see. I don't know, just kind of see what happens based off of how the current work is going and ultimately make a quality call there.
And from an STK CLI point of view and MSBuild, we still have things on the agenda, so we're still working. We still have work to do, and Preview 6 is not feature complete. However, we think we pretty much have our backlog set. I will say that something was discussed over the weekend on Twitter that may make it in, but it's a very, very small thing. And so we're pretty much set in terms of the way we're thinking about the release. At least from our perspective, we're not finished working on the release by any means.
That's a good time to tell folks what our kind of close down schedule looks like. So
sure,
I believe in the first half of August, I heard the date August 8th, but I'm definitely not going to promise that. First half of August, we're going to branch for the 5.0 release, which means we'll create a branch for 5.0 RC blah, and then master will become .NET 6. So that should happen in the first half of August, and that's And that means also that our like process for getting features and bug fixes, like I shouldn't say features, there should be no more new features at that point. Bug fixes, they all have to be approved at that point and go through a rigorous process.
So one question that was asked in chat is, what about macOS on ARM?
Yeah, that'll come in servicing.
Servicing for 5.0. Yeah,
that's our current plan. It hasn't been locked down yet. We actually have a meeting later today, so hopefully lock down our plan there. But so that would be my expectation.
So that means there will be no 3.1 update that will support ARM64.
That's also, yeah, good question. That's also my plan, is 5.0 only, 5.0 plus only.
Yeah, so 6 would then be the first LTS that will support that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That's also what we're doing for Windows ARM64. We decided not to backport that to 3.1, even though we absolutely had a conversation on that.
I think we generally don't backport features, right? Like we only do it if there's a strong reason to do so.
Yeah, the Windows ARM64 one would have been definitely much easier for us to backport to 3.1. So that was purely a policy decision, slightly less about cost, although some cost because we're kind of in a constrained, we're in a kind of a hard period because of the pandemic. But for the Apple Silicon one, it's definitely much more risk for a backport.
And when you say servicing release, I mean, there's not a minor version of 5, right? So it effectively will be a patch style update to 5, right?
Yeah, it'll just be, 5.0.n.
It's probably more like a 6-digit number. Yeah, so like one question was asked is getting mono on everything on the same BCL that was pushed to 6, right? That is generally true. We have pushed out some of the Xamarin conversion stuff that we wanted to do for 5 to 6.
Yeah, the only part where that's not true is we are doing the convergence thing for WASM.
Yep.
So WASM uses the mono runtime. We are moving to the... Oh. Yeah, we are moving to the new BCL.
Yeah, new or same, right? Depending on viewpoint.
Sorry.
But yeah.
It's new to WASM.
WASM right now runs on mono, right? And for 5, the plan is to get that on top of the core base.
Yeah, they're currently working on that.
I think that underscores that we're working on that, the whole mono convergence. We're working on all of that. We're doing it on a couple of different areas right now. It just isn't going to be quality ready for November, so it all got pushed out by a year. We're basically taking longer to get it done so that we can get other things done in the meantime, and so that we can spend the time to get it right. So it's still in process.
But don't leave people with the idea that the WASM part of the convergence isn't going to be quality in the 5.0 timeframe since you're shipping that.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We're limiting what we do so that we can keep the quality high on what we actually have out there. That would be a much better way to put it. Thanks, Rich. Yeah.
Yeah. Turns out you only have 2 dials, right? The amount of stuff you deliver and the quality. So.
Oh no, one more dial.
Yeah, but that dial doesn't work. We know that.
Yeah, and how much fun you have doing it.
Also we fixed time, right? So at this point, it's I don't know, but like no, I'm actually quite happy with what we have for 5.0, and we will not be bored for 6.0, so that's also good.
No, that we won't.
Yeah, so somebody says, not related to any of you probably, but as a Unity game dev, I dream of the day I can use proper core APIs in Unity. So I've recently talked to Unity. They are still on .NET Standard 2.0. We tried to talk to them about, at least supporting .NET Standard 2.1. But that's still a few years out because they're on a fairly different schedule from where we are. So that will still take a little bit because right now they're also still running on the monobits with their own runtime on top of it. And so moving to some sort of converged core will probably require us to do more of the heavy lifting on our side first, where we get more of the mono workloads on top of core to actually make sure that they have enough service area to plumb their stuff on top of that. But I would think eventually that will happen, right? It's just a matter of time. Because I mean, like Unity also wants to do things that have nothing to do with just churning the underlying platform, right? So, yeah, later. Kathleen, did you have something to show or talk about?
No, I was just looking. I tried to install something to see if it made it into Preview 6, and it didn't. And so, I mean, I can say that we're doing some work to clean up some of the .NET New experiences. So we do know that they've gotten pretty out of sync with several things. Think of it just as a neater experience when you say .NET help. You're no longer going to get the help you asked for plus the listing you didn't ask for and have to scroll back up to find the help that you actually asked for. So we're going to be doing some stuff like that to clean up, and we've also got a performance improvement that you're going to see. And so these are the small template things that are coming into 5, and then for 6 and possibly extending to 7, we have bigger ideas in that space. Yeah. Feedback always welcome on CLI, MSBuild, other questions. So yeah, welcome. If you're a template author, I would love for you to reach out, because templates authoring is going to change a little bit over the next couple of Visual Studio versions. So this is largely driven by Visual Studio changes, and we're trying to make uptake of that as simple as possible. But if you have, and we're working on a backwards compatibility story as well. But if you have templates that you're delivering either to CLI or Visual Studio, I'd be quite happy to have a chat with you about what you're doing and how we can keep from making your life very painful, because you're supporting other people that we also care about.
Somebody just said Scott Hanselman mood colors. I have no idea what this is in reference to, but
What?
Yeah, about the dogs, Max is posting on Reddit the monthly updates. That's very well received, apparently.
Cool.
All right, so then unless there's more questions, I think that's it for today, unless one of you has something more to add.
We ended on time?
It seems like that.
Yeah, I think I got all my things in.
I hope to have more next month. And Philip is muted, although we can see his mouth move.
I'm good.
All right.
Are both of you good? Is the big one also good, or does the big one want to speak for now? Or no? All right, then thanks everybody for listening in, and then I hope I see you in, I think, what is it, 4 weeks from now? Something like that, right?
All right.
Yeah.
All right, everybody wave. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.